heard the conventional view.
Now prepare yourself to hear the other side.
High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison, and Spears.
All right, welcome to a Sunday evening edition of The Other Side. I am one half of The Other Side, Justin Spears. And as the old hip hop song goes, it takes two, right? And he may not be internationally known, but he's known to rock the microphone. Mr. Mike Margison. Mike, what's going on, man?
You're digging way back.
Let me ask you, are you a Rob Bass and a DJ Easy Rock fan?
Is that who it is? I actually had somebody else in mind.
Yeah.
I was gonna say,
it takes two. That's
okay.
I think a classic wedding song now, along with the electric slide and all that. But
yeah, that's like early 90s stuff.
Yeah, that's some classic going back in the vault right there, hip hop. So yeah, we're really excited to be with you guys this evening, and welcome. If you're a first time listener, welcome to the show. You might be thinking, what have I gotten myself into? If you're a normal subscriber or listener, again, welcome back. This is The Other Side, a podcast that is dedicated to helping to bring, all aspects of these issues and subjects that we talk about here in our classrooms as high school teachers, in our communities as citizens, and just throughout the Twitter sphere and on social media and things of that nature. And so we're in the middle of a two-part series here. We're going to wrap that up here this week, whereas last week we kind of took you through a little bit of the purpose of dialogue. We had kind of brought up the idea of what is the role of dialogue, and should we be looking to convert people to an ideology, or should it be more of the traditional sense of tolerance, right? Where you could hear somebody out and think, okay, well, I disagree with that, or you disagree with me. Okay, so be it. We're going to still cooperate, get along, and figure out a way to live together. Or, should we be out more looking to convert people to our way of life? And so the second part of this that we're going to bring to you tonight is, in the process of getting involved in the dialogue, it's incumbent upon us that we make sure that we understand what it is that we're discussing. What is it that we're talking about? Again, the whole purpose of this show, The Other Side, is, we feel like there's so much conventional wisdom out there, right? Or whatever you would want to call this. But, it's almost kind of like this idea that whatever it is that we're discussing is already settled up to a point. Now we're going to talk about how to move forward from here. And we are here to say, no, that's not right. And by and large, a lot of the stuff that is agreed upon as quote unquote settled isn't settled and is misinterpreted or just flat out wrong. And so we feel like no matter what your position is, whether you're a left-leaning libertarian or more on the right side of the aisle, that it's important from a purpose of conducting that dialogue with another person, that you fully and completely understand the concept as opposed to jumping in. And I think kind of the poster child that I had in mind for this when Mike and I were kicking this around was, this idea born that's gaining traction again from Ocasio-Cortez and Sanders on universal healthcare or Medicaid for all or whatever they're calling it. And it's just like this foregone conclusion, right? That this is, a human basic right. And so now the dialogue is, okay, how are we going to pay for it? And I'm blowing the whistle. I'm saying, time out. We need to go back and have this discussion and talk about, is this a universal basic human right? To which I think it is not. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. So that was kind of the crux for this. And so in having discussions with Mike as we were getting ready for this episode this week, I said, look, here are two examples that I'll talk about on the show. And we could obviously, identify many, many others. But I'm going to identify two types of people out there that have a tendency to do this, where they just jump into the middle, forego any discussion about whether or not, what they're going to discuss is right or not. And really the dangers behind doing that. What is the problems with doing it that way? So the two types of people that I've identified, and I run into these a lot in my line of work, either as just being an educator or more specifically as an educator in the social studies. And the first one is the guy that says, if we could just get back to the Constitution. And you hear this a lot from conservatives in particular. This is a rallying cry of conservatives that say, if we could just get back to the Constitution. And my point with that is, I don't think that people really fully understand what the Constitution has to say about whatever that topic is, whether it be abortion or the death penalty or gay rights or whatever it might be, right? And then the second one is the guy that will always go around quipping, if we only had more money. And I hear this one a lot in education as it relates to education. But, we also hear this too with any other public good that's being proposed as to, the government being the solution to an issue. Oftentimes they'll kind of, say, oh, well, it's going to work. We just need more money, right? We need to tax the wealthy more. We need to hit the 1% up more. And then, there's no discussion about whether or not, said project is going to fail or not. They already have full faith and confidence that the government is going to run it efficiently. So let's kind of go back and talk about number one here. If we could just get back to the Constitution. Now, when I say that, Mike, are there any times that you've heard that specifically mentioned in context to any topic or any particular group of people that you have heard use that before as a response to, an issue in society?
Yeah, I'm sure I have, but nothing directly off the top of my head where I can remember, so-and-so saying, yeah, let's just get back to the Constitution. But that's a pretty common retort these days. But kind of like you said in the opener, a lot of people really don't know what the Constitution says and what limits it places on the government. And so that's usually, it ends up just being kind of a meandering argument that doesn't go anywhere, because the Constitution is pretty specific in what allows Congress and the executive to do. And when we're discussing things like, Medicare, or gosh, I remember just, what was it, a couple of months ago, you and I were discussing the Farm Bill. Remember that?
Yeah.
On here? And I don't know if we touched it. I'm sure we did, but where in the Constitution does it allow for the federal government to take money out of my earnings and subsidize a farmer for growing more wheat or less corn or whatever it wants it to do? So anyway, the point is, kind of like you were saying in the opener, I think a lot of what is actually in the Constitution is missed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of things that are important to ponder when you hear that, right? When you hear somebody say, if we could just get back to the Constitution, because I think, initially from an emotional perspective, if you believe in what the Constitution is as a blueprint for what the government can and cannot do, your initial reaction might be to say, oh, yeah, you're right. We need to just get back to the Constitution. And I think what can happen there then is the unfortunate thing where you start to get groupthink, right? Where you hear popular figures that may be uttering those types of statements, but you don't really ever ponder them very much to say or think on them or reflect on them or go research them enough to say, well, what does that even mean? What does it even mean to get back to the Constitution? Because I think by saying that, and it might sound like I'm parsing words or, just nitpicking here, but I do think it's an important thing to recognize, is to ask the question, when were we ever abiding by the Constitution? Because one could make a claim, right, that if you study and understand the manner in which the Constitution was ratified, it was very contentious. I mean, look, I try to get my high school students in government class to understand this. We're getting ready to take this on later this coming week. And that is, I think the narrative is the miracle in Philadelphia, right? That, there's this halo, the glowing halo over the Constitution, and Jesus Christ came down out of the skies and handed it to the founders in Philadelphia. And I've heard people make that religious connection and tie to it being, divine intervention and things of that nature, which there may or may not have been some semblance of, a religious overtone to what was happening. I know Benjamin Franklin gave a prayer at one point because they were just spinning their wheels. I mean, they were really just stuck, couldn't come to a compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in the room, the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, the small states, or however you want to identify the factions that had formed there. And look, the reality is, too, that there were gentlemen there who had put their whole life on hold. I mean, these guys weren't career politicians the way that people are today. They left their farms, they left their shipping businesses, they left their families, their wives at home to take care of all that in service of, doing this out of duty for what was going on. And so to understand all of that is vital to understanding what is meant when you say, let's just get back to the Constitution. So that's one thing. The other part, as you were hitting on there, is to understand what's in the document. When you were talking about the farming subsidies and things of that nature, yeah, I mean, you have to really dig and contort some meanings there in order to be able to justify those actions. And I think by and large, those are actions that would be considered acceptable or even, be things that would be desirable by Republicans and conservatives, right? Because by and large, you're talking about rural farmers who are, pretty much going to be Republican voters by and large. And so here again,
that's what we were talking about. We were talking about who was the guy who he didn't make it? He got bounced. The swamp creature we were talking about. Todd Rokita. It was Rokita, and he's a Republican, and he claims to be a staunch conservative and a constitutionalist. Yet he was in full support of this behemoth of a farm bill. But look, I mean, the Constitution, it's so narrow in what it actually allows the government to do. Look, you can collect taxes, pay debts, coin money, regulate commerce, establish immigration and naturalization laws, weights and measures, post offices, raise an army, and that's about it. Like that. That's about all it says.
Right, absolutely. And that's so important. I was talking with my brother over the weekend. We were at a family get together, and he and I kind of were having a side conversation. And I don't even remember how we got upon it, but he kind of had mentioned to me that, hey, I'm kind of getting into understanding politics. And I said, oh, that's great. That's awesome. And he's like, yeah, I'm starting to understand what a conservative and a liberal is, and what, a Republican and a Democrat is all about. And so we were kind of talking a little bit, and it got to the point where I said something about the Constitution, and he looked at me kind of sideways, like, you've read all of that? And I said, well, it's really not as big of a document as you would think. I said, Article 1's fairly long. It talks a lot about Congress and what it can do. And I said, then Article 2 gets into the executive, which is, the president's responsibility. And, just kind of walking him through this and everything. And I said, there's not a whole lot more other than, I said, really, other than, if you can kind of get past the language of the time, it's not written, at a very high academic level. It's not filled with flowery language. It's pretty straightforward. Where we've gotten astray, right? And I'm sure this is kind of what you were referring to there with this, is the interpretation of clauses and phrases. And we've talked about that before in previous episodes, right? We've talked about the general welfare clause, the necessary and proper clause, and it's politicians seizing on those and contorting them and twisting them into policy positions that they think they can justify with their voting base, that allows them to be able to do these things, even though when you look at them, you would say there's no way you can justify that as a constitutional granted authority. Again, what it all ends up kind of boiling down to is which side of the political aisle are you on, right? And I don't remember if I said this to you or it came out of something else, but it was kind of talking about Republicans. And I was picking on them a little bit. And I said, the problem with Republicans is that they campaign like libertarians and they govern like Democrats. And just kind of taking a shot at them, because what do you hear them say all the time? For small government, limited government, power to the people, property rights, all this stuff that we would shake our head at and go, yeah, I'm with you. And then they get into office and they pull a Todd Rokita, like you just said. They vote for these bloated subsidy programs. They use the power of the NSA and the TSA. They're war hawks. They're big spenders. I mean, there's been all kinds of studies about Republican presidents here over the modern times and how much money they spent on social programs and things of that nature. So, the facts and the evidence are there. Again, when you hear somebody say that, just get back to the Constitution, we should definitely stop and pause and encourage them. We don't have to be demeaning. We don't have to put them down, but we should ask questions. We should push back and say, well, tell me what you mean by that. Can you give me some concrete examples of what you mean when you say just get back to the Constitution? And I think what that would do is it would expose them, one, where they wouldn't know, or two, I think you would be able to use it as an example to say that's not constitutional, right?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think that's probably where 80% of the conversations would end up.
Yeah, so that's and again, that's one of the reasons why it's so important to understand the basis of what it is that the dialogue is about, and not just jumping in on a statement like that and moving forward. And so then the second one is,
Justin, I also want to say that it's also settled science, apparently, that the Constitution is superior to the Articles, and that's something that is debatable as well. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's just, it seems like it's axiomatic that the Constitution is superior to the Articles of Confederation for what you don't even have to explain why. You don't have to explain yourself. But I mean, there was much, much less central government in the Articles. And actually, if it were up to me, we would go back to that. But that's not even that's not even in the area code. You can't even have that conversation.
Right. And that, again, is something that I think people should really study and go and look at and ask the question, well, why? What was going on that wanted to force the hand of, Federalists like Madison and Hamilton and John Jay and George Washington, to want to pull these delegates together to drop this bombshell of a new government? I mean, again, I know we've mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating here because, again, it ties back into what we were just talking about here, getting back to the Constitution. Well, let's talk about the manner in which the Constitution's plans were hatched. When they met in Philadelphia, remember, the state delegates were told they could go to Philadelphia under the guise that they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation, not to create this brand new system of government. So the whole thing, whatever you want to say, whether it was bogus, phony, a trick, whatever, but it definitely dropped a bombshell on those guys when Edmund Randolph stands up on behalf of the Virginia delegation and presents the Virginia plan, and he starts talking about this new central government, and it just kind of drew caught everybody off guard. And so understanding that history is so important, and that's the side that isn't taught today. It's just not taught that way in schools. It's not taught that way in popular history. We just gloss over that, and that's so important, understanding how we've gotten to where we are today. And that's one of the things I try to tell the kids is, look, I could just jump in and say, okay, here we go, guys, U.S. government. We're going to talk about the way in which the three co-equal branches of government work, and just start exploring them and talking about modern current events and modern presidencies. But without that firm foundation of understanding what led to that, and I take it all the way back to the question of, why do we even need government? What is the purpose of government? We go back to man in the state of nature, and we talk about the Enlightenment, and we talk about the influences on people. When you had things like Common Sense and Rights of Man and Two Treatises on Government, those are classic works that I would really encourage people to read, they're not overly difficult to grasp. I mean, you may have to read through them a couple times just because of the verse, the language that's used might be a little difficult to navigate through, but the concepts are sharp and clear and very easy to understand. So again, that's kind of my pitch for that one. Now, finally, what I wanted to go through here on this second one, and this is one that we hear a lot in education, but again, this could transcend into other programs, any kind of public program that you hear being espoused as to why the government needs to be the problem solver of an issue is if we only had more money. Right. And again, in education, I hear this and it just really drives me up the wall. I had a conversation with a friend of mine a couple of months ago. There was a referendum on the ballot in a town near where I live. There's referendums being proposed all across the state. The most notable one right now here in Indiana is up in Noblesville, where there was a school shooting. And so now the superintendent is, I believe, asking for $50 million over, I forget if it's 3, 5, 10-year period. I forget what the length of time is on it. And again, Governor Holcomb, our governor here in the state of Indiana, throwing money at school safety and security by buying metal detector wands or something that's supposed to help make schools safe and things of that nature. There's just always this quest for more money. And I even saw a Facebook post earlier today on a group that I'm a part of, where this lady was making a comment about how essentially we attach the value of a kid's education based off property values of the community that they live in. And what does that say about the worth of that child? And, it's that kind of ignorance that people just don't understand because they've jumped in the middle of this issue, right? They're not stopping to go back and analyze the problems. And so when we think about that, right, you have to go back and say, well, first off, why are you requesting more money, right? I mean, there's an admission there that if you're requesting more money, you don't have enough for what it is that you're wanting to do. And I think the adequate question as a taxpayer is why? Why don't you have enough money? I want to know what you're spending taxpayer dollars on. I want to know and understand, what it is that is the money is being spent on, because if you've ever been in charge of a budget before, which I have for several years, when I was in the business world, I was in charge of line item budgets and running departments and things of that nature. I couldn't just go to my superiors and say, I'm sorry, this budget that you've given me isn't going to cut it. I need more money. They would look at me and say, no, this is the budget. You got to do something creatively to find a way to work within the confines of what we've given you. And you know what I would oftentimes find, Mike? I wasn't tapping into all of the resources that I had available to me. I was tunnel vision and I was seeing things a certain way. And that was always leading to, I need more resources. I need more money, when I had resources around me all along that I could be using in a different way. And I think all too often today, we find ourselves, whether we're talking about schools or whether we're talking about, I even saw somebody who was had a conversation with a postal carrier, from the post office, and they were complaining about their Amazon contract. And I've noticed a lot more USPS trucks out on Sundays. And I actually have a good friend who's a postal worker here in the area that I live in. And I asked her about that a couple months ago, and she said, "Yeah, it's our Amazon contract. We have to be available to deliver 7 days a week." And so, they always say, well, we just need more money to be able to run this more efficiently because we can't do it on the budget that we're on. And we know that, that organization is hemorrhaging money as well. So again, this if we only had more money argument, to me, is a textbook example of jumping in the middle of a issue where you're not really truly examining the root causes of why you're even needing to ask for more money to begin with. And that is such an important exercise.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that actually, it brings me to a story that I heard this weekend. And this is about as odd as it gets, but I found myself standing firmly behind Rahm Emanuel, mayor of Chicago, supporting him. Did you happen to see the story on him this past weekend?
No, I did not.
Well, anyway, we were talking about they were talking about the gun violence in Chicago and the number of people who have been shot and killed. And um, Emmanuel finally just said, look, we're going to have a politically incorrect conversation about this and get to the root cause of the issue, because they were asking for more resources or, whatever. It's just exactly what you're talking about. And again, this is Emmanuel of all people. He said, let's look at faith and family in the communities where you have this violence, and it just doesn't exist. And anytime you have a situation where communities lack faith and family, you're going to see chaos and it's going to get ugly. And that's the conversation that we need to have. And I listened to that and I was just thinking, my gosh, A, I can't believe I'm agreeing with Rahm Emanuel, but B, what a bunch of courage it took for a leftist to say that. And you can imagine the rest of the left, they were infuriated. I mean, they weren't having any of it, and they were just ripping them to shreds. But yeah, that is actually digging down to the root cause of a problem. Now, you can ask for better schools or more tax money or more policemen. That's not the problem. That's not the problems they're having in Chicago. There is some serious moral decay in these areas that has to be addressed, and it needs to be talked about.
Wow, that is phenomenal. I did not see that. I must have missed that over the weekend, but that's terrific to hear, man. I mean, honestly, listen, I'll give him props. There's a lot that I disagree with Rahm Emanuel on, but for him to come out and say that, yeah, I can absolutely understand. But that's what we need, right? We need more serious. And listen, that conversation is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to have from the perspective of just bringing it up, but then it's also uncomfortable for him, because now, like you said, he's going to be catching heat from his base about that. But that's what we need more of. We need more of the courage for people to stand up and go back and say, look, what is causing all this? Because there's tons of legislation on the book. There's tons of, police and resources and everything that the government could do here is being done. Really, there's what more can be done? What more would more money do here to help solve this problem? And for him to stand up and say that, I think is fantastic. And I think that's the kind of thing on both sides of the aisle that we need more of, going back and looking at what is causing this problem. Again, the same thing in schools is happening, whether it's with per pupil spending. There's all kinds of questions in major metropolitan areas and cities about the condition of the buildings of these schools. And people just say, well, we need money to repair it. And my question is, as a taxpayer of that community, I would want to know why. What led to this, right? What caused this to happen? It can't just wholly be that through natural process these things have fallen apart. There was some neglect here. And if that's the case, why do I want to give more money to a neglectful group of people that are just going to squander more of it? And, I really think that that's one of the biggest missing pieces in terms of reform today in our education system across this country is an accountability factor. It's always the question to the taxpayers to pay more money, but there's never anything, in my opinion, now I know people will disagree with this because I've been told I was wrong on this, accountability to where this money is being spent. I mean, we know it. In my time in education, I can count on one hand the number of times when an initiative that cost the school district money, meaning that they paid for something, had a lasting impact and wasn't just tossed to the wayside after a certain period of time, whether it be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year, and then it's on to the next shiny thing, and it's a request for more money to do more things. And so again, I think those are the kinds of conversations. So when people start talking about, well, if we only had more money, that is another textbook example of jumping in the middle of the conversation and not taking the time to stop and say, hey, Why are we in this situation? And that's what I wanted to leave you guys with, especially those of you that are listening in our radio audience here this week on 92.1 and 1550, is make sure that you take time, and it may not hit you until afterwards, in the heat of a discussion or a debate or dialogue. You may be so emotional or wrapped up in it, you tend to let it go. But as you reflect back on those conversations, make sure you take time to follow up and say, wait a second, after we talked last, I had some questions and you made some statements, and I need you to defend those or justify or explain, clarify what you meant by these, because I have identified this issue that I think gets more at the root of what we're talking about. And I think only then will we see more deliberative dialogue that results in people actually clearly thinking about the subject in which they are debating. Mike, you have any other closing comments before we leave our radio audience?
No, I think you did a good job. I think you hit it. I actually, just while you were finishing up there, I pulled up this quote, and I want to read it real quick, because I think this perfectly articulates exactly what you were talking about. Emmanuel said, he said, this quote, "This may not be politically correct, but I know the power of what faith and family can do, and our kids need that structure." And I'm asking that we also don't shy away from a full discussion about the importance of family and faith, helping to develop and nurture character, self-respect, a value system, and a moral compass that allows kids to know good from bad and right from wrong. If we're going to solve this, we have to have a real discussion. Parts of the conversation cannot be off limits because they're politically uncomfortable. I thought he nailed it there. Absolutely nailed it.
Yeah, kudos to him, man. And I really, the phrase that just like jumped out to me as you were reading that is he said full discussion, right? Not something that's going to allow him to control the narrative as a politician, but a comprehensive full look at how that goes. And you went on to list all of those things. And I think that is really, really important. And listen, I hope he wasn't just saying that to appease, a certain group of people. I hope he's serious about it. I hope the people of Chicago get serious about it and take back their communities, right? As individuals, not through government coming in and creating a military state or police state or confiscating weapons or, doing any other inane thing from a policy perspective, but letting the citizens have control over it, I think is going to be vital to that. And I hope that kind of gains some traction for them up there. So again, thank you to those who have joined us on 92.1 1550 AM, WCVLAM.com. You can catch this show rebroadcast every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. on that radio station and online there. We hope that you can catch us there. And again, thanks to those guys over there at the station for working so hard to get this show on the air there. We really appreciate that. For those that are listening via YouTube, Spreaker, iTunes, or Google, we like to carry the conversation forward onto the other side with a little bonus content, which we will do here in just a moment. Okay, Mike, that was, I think, really refreshing to kind of think about because even as I was going through that dialogue with you, obviously I had prepped for this, and in my prep for it, I had, clearly thought about some examples here. And like I said, I could have brought up many other numerous examples here of how we all too often today jump into the middle of an issue and attack it there and really never get around to looking at the roots of the problem. And I wanted to throw out there something that we have kind of hit on and, been a common thread in a lot of our shows. Clearly based on our worldview and ideology, we find, I would think it's safe to say 0.0% commonality with the ideology of socialism, which has gained a lot of traction. There's been all kinds of studies that have been popping up in the mainstream media and on social media about the rise of the acceptance of socialistic policies amongst millennials and even others. And I mentioned, earlier on in the show, Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and even others that are more moderate, usually Democrats that are advocating these policies. You can't help but feel scared about the direction in which we are headed with so many buying into this worldview that really is very, very damaging in the long run. And so I was wondering if maybe you could just talk a little bit about why that is so dangerous. I don't want you to feel like you have to give a whole recap on socialism, but most importantly, maybe drawing that connection to what the danger is with so many that are buying into this ideology, and maybe looking at some historical examples of what can happen when this is ascribed to.
Well, I think the biggest problem is that people don't know what socialism is. They don't know what they're asking for. And if they did, they wouldn't be asking for it. Socialism is people in 2018 in Venezuela eating zoo animals because they don't have anything to eat. That is socialism. Socialism is people in North Korea picking grass off the side of the road and harvesting it for food because they can't get enough calories. That's what socialism gets you. And we can go through I can go through a long list of nations that have firmly committed themselves to economic socialism: the USSR, North Korea, Cuba, most recently Venezuela, and then virtually every sub-Saharan African nation, with a couple of exceptions: Botswana, South Africa, but they're all a type of gangster socialism, where it's essentially just a corrupt socialist regime. And these are the poorest countries on the planet. I mean, the standard of living is absolutely primitive. It'd be like dialing it back 400 years from where we live today. That's actually what socialism is. What people want now is free stuff without working for it. That's it. They want somebody else to pay their doctor bill. That's what they're asking for. So what they don't realize is that actual socialism, I don't think Ocasio-Cortez knows what she's getting herself into. When you ask the government to socialize something like healthcare, that is a monumental task, where you take the factors of production in arguably the most important service in the nation, and you put them in control of a bunch of bumbling fools in DC who have not the slightest background in running a business or medicine. They don't. They're lawyers. And we're asking them to manage our healthcare. And if you sit back and you think about it that way, you might think, actually, yeah, that doesn't sound so good. Congress has what? A 7% approval rating, and we want these people managing our health outcomes? No, I mean, nobody would submit to that. So honestly, what I think, I don't think she's very smart. I think that's her biggest problem. But the people who are getting behind this, I think the long and we did talk about this last week, but I think the long and the short of it for them is, listen, if I don't have to face that doctor bill, sign me up. Good enough. But they don't really know what the long-term consequences are. And the long-term consequences are dire, and they're real. And if you don't believe them, look at Venezuela, which just a couple of decades ago was one of the most prosperous countries in South America because they are oil rich, really wealthy. And now they can't feed themselves. It's sad.
Yeah, it really is. You're absolutely right. And again, the thing that we have to think about here, guys, is as we tie this back into the goal of dialogue, as you're coming up against this, if you're talking to people who are, throwing out these overtones of, and I see it all the time via social media. I'm even hearing it more in person, where I hear people talk about, it's not fair that, such and such would run out of healthcare days while they're battling cancer, or sick days while they're battling cancer. And so now they have to do a crowdsourcing for sharing sick days at work so they can get their treatments, and, just on and on and on. Again, you can get into a debate and a discussion about the merits of socialized medicine versus the private market, but we have to go back to understanding, is this a basic right? Because all government should be doing is protecting those basic rights and liberties and freedoms. And I don't know how you can make a claim, because health care does not exist in the state of nature. There's no, tree where hospitals are growing on, out of the ground, or trees where X-ray machines are being produced, or none of that. All of the factors, like you said, exactly right. The factors of production discussion that needs to be had, and that goes back to one of the things that she had mentioned in particular, had put out a Facebook post over the weekend where she was giving her followers an update on some of the work that she was doing. And she made some comment about a co-op cafe that she had visited. And she talked about how she just loves supporting worker-owned businesses. And I saw that and I went, I just wanted to pound my head into the wall and go, what is she talking about? Worker owned, what business is not owned by a worker? That really gives you a
robot owned businesses, apparently.
but
But I don't know where they are, but apparently there are robot owned businesses.
right, yeah. But I think the frightening thing is that gives you a sense as to where their foundation and worldview is, how they view the world. They think that business owners like the Waltons or the Gates or the Jobs or whoever of the world, the Ellisons, that they're not workers. They're not workers. Are you kidding me? Think of all the work that those people have done to get their businesses built up to where they are, all the work that they continue to do to make sure that things are running right now. Look, are they working, 60-hour work weeks on the factory floor? Of course not. They have sacrificed so much to bring those factors of production together to make sure that this product that makes your life better. And by the way, she's like holding, she's wearing like a designer dress and glasses and a Starbucks cup or something like that in the photo. And I'm sitting there going, if it weren't for capitalism, even crony capitalism, as they like to call it, if it weren't for that, the free market, you wouldn't have any of that stuff right now. And so it's just those are the discussions that we need to have with people as they talk about what the role of government should be in providing goods and services to the market, and the ideas of the free market versus socialism. We've got to understand that you've got to attack that ideology before you can have a discussion about the government's role, because then if you do that, then you've fallen into their trap, right? They know that if they can get you discussing universal health care and how it's going to be paid for, you've already conceded the fact that this is maybe something that could exist or even should exist, instead of saying, whoa, time out, wait a second. Before we even talk about government, let's have a conversation about whether or not this is the right thing to do or not. And I think it was you that brought up an excellent point that, during the primaries of the 2018 election, Bernie and Hillary were talking, and that question was brought up about, is healthcare a basic right? And Bernie mumbled his way through some answer, and there was no pushback. There was no pushback at all. We talk about a free press, guys. Listen, the role of the free press should be to give it to them on both sides. Don't give anybody a pass. And that happens all too often. I think you were also the one that had mentioned Ocasio-Cortez on maybe Trevor Noah or one of the nightly shows. Maybe it was Chris Cuomo, and him asking these hard hitting questions. But then she gives these inane answers and there's no pushback. It's just, oh, okay. And then move on. Like she just mumbled, gave the greatest oration ever about these topics. So we have to be free and independent thinkers. And we've got to understand the roots of these issues in order to have meaningful dialogue that's really going to, hopefully, the goal here, cause people to think and realize, wait a second, something's rotten in Denmark, and we need to get this thing squared away here.
Yeah, you're right. And this is one of the reasons why, I had mentioned it earlier in the earlier part of the show, but why I would prefer the articles to the Constitution. And you were talking in the beginning about people saying, let's just get back to the Constitution. But the Constitution it's so violated at this point. But it's allowed to be, just because the language in there is so vague, and the 10th Amendment is simply not respected. Like I was mentioning there, it is so narrow in what it actually allows government to do. It's just that nobody respects it. And I think that just all has to be scrapped. And what we need to get back to is that look, like your life, your liberty, and your property. That's it. That's what each person owns. And nobody, even a government official, nobody has claim to your life, your liberty, or property. Nobody else on the planet. Nobody should be allowed to murder you because that's taking your life. Nobody should be allowed to sexually assault you. Right? I mean, and nobody should be allowed to take some of your paycheck because they think it's important, because that's just theft of your property. All right. Though I think that the entire document, the whole system, the whole institution needs to be revisited and rewritten so that we champion individual liberty and we don't give even the slightest inch to a central authority. Because as we saw, look, if you give them an inch, they will take miles and miles and miles.
Yeah, that's really well said. And that's one of the questions that I pose to my government kids is as we talk about the concept of limited government, which was born out of the rebellion away from the divine right of kings is, how has that held up over time? Are we, in other words, are we always just kind of moving in one direction or the other on the continuum of absolute power, monarchy, authoritarianism on one side, anarchy on the other? Are we constantly kind of in flux, moving back and forth, or is there a sweet spot where we can say, here's what limited government looks like? Now, I'm making the claim, right, wrong, or indifferent, that I think we are sliding along the continuum, and unfortunately, I think we're sliding toward authoritarianism, which, look, it was there from the beginning. Alexander Hamilton advocated for a king as the executive, right? I mean, these guys that hatched this plan of the Constitution, not all of them were in agreement on everything.
And with a lifetime appointment.
Right, yeah. But, there were definitely some things that I think, if people knew it, they would say, well, wait a second, what were you just rebelling from? Right. I mean, that to me seems like a no brainer, but yet people, nowadays, we've talked about this before, liberty and freedom being difficult. We want somebody else to solve the problem. Let me just ship my money through my tax dollars to Leviathan, let them fix it and move on. We've gone over all that ad nauseum before. So yeah, no, I think that's really well said, Mike. I think that's absolutely an accurate statement of where we are. And, again, we're trying to encourage people to think, if at the end of the day you walk away and you say, hey, I think that this is the most appropriate method for doing this, as long as you can, justify it and defend it, we'll let it win out in the battle of battle of ideas and go from there. But just jumping in again to the middle of these issues is so dangerous and really kind of speaks to the laziness of people not fully understanding the dialogue. So that's going to wrap it up for this episode. Next week, where I'm super excited about this. I know Mike is as well. He's kind of been the driving force with this one. We are going to be starting our presidential series, and we're going to be starting with George Washington. Mike, is there anything in particular that you want to kind of give away, or do we just want the listeners to have to tune in to hear what we're going to talk about?
No, just tune in to hear. I mean, this is going to be a side of George Washington that you certainly did not get in school. But I think it's a side that needs to be heard. In the entire series, we're going to go over some of the presidents that are kind of big names because they come up in the textbooks, and people just kind of generally think, well, they must be some of the greats: Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Some of the big ones. And we're going to offer some critiques of them, and we're going to offer some critiques of Washington. But we're also going to talk intermittently there about some of the ones that you may have recognized the name, but boy, it would take a lot for you to remember that they were even president. John Tyler and Franklin Pierce and Andrew Johnson and some of these other ones that generally just kind of get swept into the dustbin of history. And they do these nonsense presidential rankings which don't mean anything, and these guys fall to the bottom for no in particular reason, because they actually were loyal to the Constitution. But we're going to talk about the other side of these guys who nobody ever learns about them in school. Like, not at all. So it's going to be a great series, and it'll be about 2 months worth of really, really good programs.
Yeah, I'm really excited and looking forward to that. I think that that's so important, just again for understanding our history and where we've come from and where we're going. And so I'm really really looking forward to that. So again, we appreciate you tuning in to this episode here of our part 2 goal of dialogue. I hope that you have walked away from listening to these last 2 shows and kind of pondering and thinking about your knowledge and where you are on these issues, and maybe hopefully encouraging you to go back and make sure that you completely understand the totality of what it is that you're talking about as you engage in conversations with those around you. So again, thank you for tuning in, and you have now heard The Other Side.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you're not fully informed until you've heard the other side.